It's a great pleasure to be talking to everyone. And I'm not talking as if I have all the answers, but I've tried to describe what I found useful and hopefully give us some food for thought. And I'm a behavioral and implementation scientist. And it's worth saying, in case you think I'm talking from a social science or implementation science perspective, I'm not doing that today. I'm talking very much as someone who's really trying to deliver on transdisciplinary research. And as Tess said, I'm part of the TARGetAMR team, and you can see our lovely faces and our institutions on the left-hand side. And I'm going to begin with talking about this idea of wicked problems and AMR. And AMR is a classic wicked problem whose scale and complexity brings challenges in both conceptualization and our actions that relate to it. So you might not be familiar with the term wicked problem, but in terms of what it is, and you can look at various academic papers or various Google sites to have a sense of how are people thinking about wicked problems. But it's typically characterized by things such as that they can be very challenging to find consensus on or agreement. They may require ongoing learning and adaptation. Wicked problems tend to be really difficult to address, and they can persist over time. They're intricate, multifaceted. They resist quick fixes or permanent solutions. There's often a high level of uncertainty and ambiguity within them. They may evolve, transform, or even reappear, and that they often involve value conflicts and diverse perspectives. They often involve numerous interdependent variables, which is part of what makes them particularly complex and hard to change. And they don't have any clear-cut, singular, universal solutions. And their complexity, their wickedness, really arises from that interconnectedness. And there are multiple and conflicting interpretations present. So, if we think about AMR, we think about AMR and One Health, you think about some of those early sort of system maps of AMR, you can see just how complex they are and how difficult AMR is to reduce and to change over time. So other wicked problems would be things like plastic pollution, climate change, for example, or reducing inequalities, poverty. And I imagine it's this sort of wicked nature of AMR that's made these funded AMR networks transdisciplinary. And it's probably a direct response to their complexity, their numerous interdependent moving parts. And I think the idea is that a transdisciplinary lens can enable us to see the main challenges of AMR differently, in a way that's quite distinct from any single discipline or any multiple disciplines working together in parallel. And I'm going to kind of tease out the differences in different ways disciplines can work together. And I think the most important thing about transdisciplinarity, and the name of the webinar today, is just that transdisciplinarity, if we look at things differently, it lets us develop new solutions or interventions to AMR's wicked problem. So you might imagine many of you have seen this before, and it's this idea of how different disciplines work together around many issues, non-wicked problems and wicked problems. But I think with wicked problems, the sort of issues are amplified. And the idea is that, depending on our home discipline, our paradigm, we might each look at a phenomenon, in this case, an elephant, and we'd see things differently to each other. So on the left-hand side, we have a microbiologist only touching the tusk of the elephant, saying it's a spear. We have an ethicist on the ground, and she's feeling the trunk and saying, oh, it's a snake. We have a computer scientist at the leg saying it's a tree. Someone else, a behavioral scientist, looking at the abdomen, saying, oh, it's just a wall. And someone playing with the tape, a mathematical modeler, saying it's a rope. So it's just that idea that from our home disciplines, we see things differently, and we might not be seeing the whole, and we're not getting that sense of synergy or looking at the problem in its entirety. So typical ways of working across disciplines are that each singular discipline uses its acumen and illuminates a small part of the larger whole. And I think most of us are trained in and expert within a discipline. A multidisciplinary approach would assemble a kind of Frankenstein elephant from multiple disparate pieces. And I do think this is the modus operandi for many of us. It's almost like a classic mixed method design with end stage integration. So things like NIHR program grants often do this really well, that we are each leading different work streams, and then at the end we kind of combine things to see what we've learnt in a better way than we would have as individuals, but not in an integrative way. Much of multidisciplinary research, I think, is often also dominated by one primary discipline, with others often seen in supporting roles. And as a social scientist, I do think a lot of the time, social science or humanities and arts maybe are seen as sort of supporting roles to sort of biomedical perspectives, for example. And the idea of the elephant and that analogy, it's only through our interdisciplinary dialogue that it's possible to see the elephant in its entirety, the full problem of AMR in all of its glorious complexity and wickedness. And this dialogue of trying to work across disciplines, I do think is not as easy as it might sound. And it's only through the way we work together in an interdisciplinary way that we can imagine what the resulting elephant could do. So we have new ways of combating AMR. And it's only through moving to trans-disciplinarity, when working with non-academic stakeholders, that the elephant can be seen as doing something in the real world. So it's just a little framework, but I think it's important to have that sense of what these terms mean and how they might be used differently. And I'm sure there are other versions of how these terms should be used and what they mean, but I do think this is quite a useful way. And I've borrowed a kind of graphic here from the Netherlands, which really tries to tease out the differences. So it's disciplinarity, what most of us have had our training in, multidisciplinarity, often working in parallel and probably trying to integrate our findings later. And I do think that's probably, it's much better than monodisciplinary work, but it's not delivering on the full promise of interdisciplinarity. And that's where we have an integrative way of working, that we might be seeing the whole problem and potential solutions differently. And then in this framework, what they see as being different about transdisciplinarity is bringing in new and other types of non-academic knowledge. So that might be from the public, it might be from service providers, it might be from industry. It's about bringing different kinds of knowledge to complement the interdisciplinary knowledge to do something deeply useful and deeply transformative for the real world. So in terms of my personal perspectives on the challenges of interdisciplinarity within AMR research, I have over the years worked on many different AMR projects with a range of different disciplines and indeed different professions. And I think, I do think these projects and outputs have been highly successful, but on reflection, I would probably categorize them as being multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. I think some of the things that can get lost when we work across disciplines is that the nuances relating to distinct contributions can easily get lost. So I know I still have a tendency to homogenize biomedical, bioscientific disciplines. And I feel the particular value of different social sciences, psychology, sociology, or anthropology, is often poorly understood by others and might be kind of homogenized into its own kind of non-biomedical thing. I suppose that's one of the reasons I wanted to say I'm not speaking as a social scientist here. I'm trying to speak as an interdisciplinary researcher. And I think some of the major challenges that can occur relate to mutual understandings across disciplines. And I think these can be really profound. So what does constitute data? What constitutes analytic techniques? What's the role or value of theory? And how, where, and what to publish? So all of these can be quite distinct across different disciplines and can drive the way we think about working together and sort of limit or facilitate or constrain how we might want to work together in different ways. I think it's also really important to say that there is a kind of mapping of power relationships often across the different disciplines. And there are ideas that about epistemology or ontology that really can shape and constrain the way we might work together. So often a positivist approach would be seen as trumping any others. Interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary working requires everyone to let go of their particular perspective and embrace a new and collective perspective. And that can be challenging. That is, to some extent, letting go of our own expertise and adopting a much more humble or a sort of a position of humility to how we understand other people's knowledge, practices, and contributions. And I do think interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary working requires quite a lot from us: mutual respect, generous explanation and translation, and probably most important of all, the time to develop a mutual understanding and translation of each other's disciplines and paradigms. So how does this relate to TARGetAMR? AMR genomics are rapidly developing, highly promising, and particularly technological. And remember, this is me as a psychologist, as a social scientist speaking. And I would argue to date, AMR genomics have largely been understood through single disciplines or at best, multidisciplinary STEM perspectives. Disciplinary perspectives from the social sciences have been notably lacking, for example, from behavioral science, implementation science, or sociology. There's quite a lot of work around the human genome that is much more sort of social science led, social science delivered, and some interdisciplinary work in that field, but not when it relates to pathogens or to AMR specifically. And equally, I would note that disciplinary perspectives from the arts and humanities are also quite hard to locate: history, design, or ethics. So as such, AMR genomics, when we think about it, there's very little multidisciplinary research around and a real lack of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work. Yet this is urgently needed for AMR genomics to really deliver on its full impact. So what might sort of be the key areas that we might need transdisciplinary work that relates to AMR genomics? And I was trying to put these in an order, and there will be an order that make particular sense to me, coming from my particular vantage point, my lens as a social scientist, trying to understand how others in the field are working and trying to understand the problems that need to be solved. So for me, one of the major issues is about the acceptability of AMR genomics. However good the bench science or technology is, if people won't use it or don't understand it or don't trust it, it's useless. I think this sort of begs questions of how we need interdisciplinary dialogue and transdisciplinary work where we're combining perspectives from psychology, sociology, genomics, media studies, and public health. And that's not a kind of definitive list at all. Also, I think many people would recognize that one of the major issues we have to resolve and address has to do with the implementability of AMR genomics. Again, how effective or acceptable AMR genomics are, unless they can be normalized and integrated into farming, food production, or health and social care, again, it's useless. We need contributions from very diverse perspectives, again, agriculture, implementation science, system science, bioinformaticians. We also need a better sense of the consequences of AMR genomics. So AMR genomics can render visible the transmission routes of AMR. And this is brilliant news in terms of allowing targeted interventions on the one hand, across that whole One Health field, but they also invite social and moral perspectives. So there are issues of culpability, negligence, or criminality that can stem from what's been rendered visible by using genomics to really understand transmission routes. This, of course, requires we need to bring together multiple disciplines to understand these issues. We need to bring people from law, ethics, history, sociology, and public health. Again, another key issue has to be, for me, the translation of AMR genomics. For them to work at scale and in the real world, AMR genomics require translation and communication to the public, farmers and vets, as well as health and social care professionals. This is important to gain any traction and affect actual change. And how do we do this? How do we think about, I really do struggle, I'm afraid to say it, in terms of understanding some of the genomics, but they need to be translated in ways that we can then, move them to use them for action and change. And I think this demands us to be working collectively, again, in interdisciplinary ways with people from art and design, behavioral science, genomics, and microbiology. So how do we communicate some of this very complex probabilistic sense of what AMR genomics is telling us about transmission routes, for them to be translated into, for example, infection prevention and control activities? Equally, in terms of other key things where we really do need interdisciplinary perspectives, it has to do with the scalability of AMR genomics. For them to really deliver on their transformative potential, it requires changes at scale. So we need multiple sort of changes across whole systems. We need changes across the pipelines for scalable technology. And again, this sort of begs questions of how we need to be having conversations with engineering, system science, and implementation science. And finally, on my sort of list of the way I'm thinking about where we need interdisciplinary thinking and working and transdisciplinary solutions within AMR genomics, it has to do with One Health surveillance. So we need to really address, if we want global One Health surveillance of AMR, it's unlikely unless we can address and deal with and minimize the major inequalities that exist across sectors, food versus animal, for example, or between nations in terms of resources and infrastructure. And again, this demands us to really draw on and work with the expertise from political science, geography, or sociology, for example. So again, all I've really done here is try and sort of make the case from my perspective around where I think some of the kind of interdisciplinary thinking and working should be taking place in this particular field. So in TARGetAMR, what we're really trying to do is genuinely deliver on transdisciplinarity and try and make that move beyond multidisciplinary work. We want to and are trying to work out the optimal approach to integrating very different perspectives, not only from different disciplines, but from non-academic stakeholders, including the public, the end users of AMR genomics, policymakers, people from industry, and to really try and think, how do we sort of move from interdisciplinarity to transdisciplinary working? And what we really hope as time goes on, the network's doing really well in terms of numbers, but we really want to increase that diversity of disciplines and partners. And that's important so that we can really contribute to the new ways of thinking about AMR and genomics. So what we're really trying to do is genuinely aspire to thinking and working differently in ways which move beyond our diverse and respective paradigms, to embrace a new way of seeing AMR genomics, a way which will transform and reduce AMR in the future.